for us as both a development and a humanitarian organisation, and I should say as a campaigning organisation, we see very much, yes, development and security are complementary. Yes, they do go together. Development, fairly obviously in a way, can promote security and stability. Stability and security can promote development. But for us, I think to say that they're complementary is very much for us, I think, in a long-term perspective, and something that we would understand in terms of thinking of security in a broad perspective as human security, in some of the ways that Sheila again talked about it, in terms of the interests and needs of the people in the country affected. And for us, the way those two big aims, development and security, go together are, if you keep the focus on poverty, if you help people to overcome poverty, if you help those people to be able to hold their own governments or the people, the elites in their country, to account, if you help those people achieve their rights, if you help them live in safety and security. And I think it may seem obvious, but it's not always obvious in practice, that if you can help countries and people achieve that sort of security and development, that is actually in the long-term interests of donors as well. But if you start the sentence at the other end and ask, what are the short-term and immediate foreign policy and security interests of donors, of the UK, of the US, of anybody else, if you go for these hearts and minds projects, the quick impact, the over-alignment with a donor security and political interest, that's when you get into all sorts of trouble, and that's what I want to unpack a little bit more. Just one more comment by way of introduction. I think when we look at the extraordinary events, mostly positive, but some also deeply troubling and worse in the Middle East and North Africa at the moment, especially the violence in Libya, but I think the more positive developments in Egypt and Tunisia, it's very clear that political and economic rights and outcomes go together. And of course that's a region where in many ways the West is seen as having traded off security interests against our own values, and we also see that Western support for autocratic and totalitarian regimes in the region didn't lead to a Middle East peace deal. It didn't even help people in many cases emerge from poverty. So I think there's a lot of challenges coming out of that today. Well, what I want to do is talk a little bit about good practice and bad practice, good trends and bad trends, how we see the world today, if we don't all see it as everybody, all the donors agreeing with what Sheila has to say, or the approach adopted by the UK today, and to then illustrate just with a few examples. I think we produced a paper in February, a public paper called Whose Aid Is It Anyway? And what we were actually looking at in that paper was the old question, but the central question of politicisation of aid, or some people prefer to call it securitisation of aid. Are we seeing aid that is less neutral, that is being more tied to the foreign policy, the security, or possibly even the trade interests of donor nations? And I think we did this paper because we were worried that is the case, that the trend is going in the wrong direction. And I think we broadly mean two things when we talk about politicisation of aid. One is where aid goes, fairly obviously, is the distribution of aid across countries. If this is development aid, is it going to the poorest? Is it going to the neediest? Or is it going according to countries' foreign policy interests? So how much do we see a skewing of aid? Is that getting better or worse? And then when you look at within a country, take a country like Afghanistan or Yemen or DRC, what is happening to the way that aid is delivered within the country? So a lot of that is what Sheila was focusing on, that delivery within a country. And I think it's pretty obvious. It's not new. Politicisation is not new. We had the whole of the Cold War. Sounds like we had it before that, back in the 19th century as well. But I think what concerns us today is that there is, to some extent, a worrying trend. And I think I'm talking internationally, not specifically the UK when I say that. And I think that trend is to do with a mixture of things. And it's partly to do with a lot of debates about aid. The purpose of aid, is aid a good thing at all? So that sort of aid questioning. It's also to do with the global economic crisis, the cuts in aid. We have been very fortunate. The British government has defended aid and kept the previous government's commitment on that, but that's not the case for lots of other European donors or around the world. And I think often, whether they're cutting or maintaining aid, governments feel they have to explain and justify more that aid to the taxpayers. It's a perfectly reasonable thing. They should have to do that. But then there's a bit of a risk that one way you do that is by saying, see, this is in your interests. And as I've already said, yes, it's in everybody's interests, at least in the long term. But if you go down that slippery path of trying to tie in short-term interests, then you get to the problem. I think if I illustrate with just literally a couple of figures, it probably won't surprise anybody in this room to find out that most of the biggest share of aid in the last decade went to 3 countries. If we look at the OECD, defines there as being 48 fragile states, but 3 of those in the last decade got a third of that aid: Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. And in Iraq, not Iran. I'm making a George Bush mistake there. And Iraq, if you look at Iraq and the money it received per head, it received about 12 times the amount of money that the Democratic Republic of Congo has received, and yet sort of none of these conflicts are directly comparable, but I think everybody knows how extensive, long run, and how many lives the conflict in DRC has taken directly and indirectly. So a huge imbalance there in the distribution of aid. And I think what we've seen in the UK, actually, along with the EU, is an approach that in many cases has been better to a lot of other donors. We've seen an approach to development that's written into the European Union Treaty that says, no, the focus must be on poverty relief, it must be on the neediest. But you also see, if you look at the bilateral aid review that came out a couple of weeks ago, and if you look at what happened to the money, the distribution of money in that review, the UK cut aid to a number of countries. Some of those were middle-income countries. There was a good case for transitioning, but some were very poor, like Niger or Burundi. And some of those top UK priority countries, like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia, did get an increased chunk of aid. Now, that's not a simple thing to then judge. I'm not standing here and saying that was all wrong or all bad. We think Yemen needs more aid. Yemen, on top of all the protests and upheaval we see today, has 7 million people who are food insecure, who are in need of food aid. We're also providing emergency water aid in some parts of Yemen. But nonetheless, if you're going to shrink the number of countries you go to, and we see the same, the Netherlands has just done the same, you have a risk that overall, even if there's just a little bit of politicisation of aid, when you add it up across all donors, you may get to a situation, as we've seen for the last 10 years, where there are some aid darlings and there are some aid orphans. And that's very much what we don't want to see. We think fragility and conflict clearly is one of the drivers of poverty, but we also know there are poor people in stable countries, and we also know, and fairly obviously, that whether you're in a priority conflict country or a not priority one, there's equal needs in terms of suffering and the sort of support we can provide. So that's the skewing of aid across countries. But let me just talk briefly about how you provide aid into those conflict and emergency situations. And I just want to run through some of what would be our key principles, and I think you'll see that a lot of those match the sorts of things Sheila was talking about, and then I'll just give a few examples of where that's happened and where that hasn't happened. So I think for us, first of all, the aid that's provided needs to be directed towards the target. If you want to have a foreign or a business policy on trade, then focus it on trade, but don't use an indirect instrument like development. So put your development aid onto reducing poverty and inequality in the long term. And not only do the short-term hearts and minds or quick impact projects, they don't work, they can be costly, they can be inefficient, they can actually be dangerous, they can put lives at risk in the local community, and they can put aid workers' lives at risk. And so, not surprisingly, as part of what we would insist on is a full respect for international humanitarian principles. And one other downside, if those aren't respected, and we do see that in some countries around the world, if those aren't respected, it can actually hamper access not only for political players, but for independent neutral players like Oxfam. I think we also think it's extremely important that aid needs to look at conflict prevention. That's already been mentioned today. So we need to be looking at states that haven't yet failed but maybe are at risk. It's really important that we're looking at what are the priority needs of people on the ground. So don't create parallel structures, don't design a perfect model from the outside. We hear a lot about policy coherence. We see that in the new National Security Council here, which in some ways we look at and worry if it may divert the poverty focus of DFID's aid. The policy coherence from our point of view needs to be for the people on the ground, for the community, for the country on the ground. It's not policy coherence for our British short-term foreign policy interests. It's about what is going to work in DRC or in Kenya or in Somalia or anywhere else. I think we also see time and again, both in situations of chronic conflict, intense rapid onset conflict, or just in normal stable development situations, the amount you can do to build bottom-up, working with citizens, especially working with women and often marginalised voices, to hold to account, to hold whatever weak state structures are there, whether it's local or national, whether it's traditional or more modern structures. There's usually a huge amount you can do to build those, what we call in our rather Oxfam jargon, active citizens. We want to see active citizens holding effective states to account. And that's especially true for the provision of security and justice. Again, it's no use or it's not enough just going into a country and saying we're going to help build a legal system or we're going to build a court building. It's got to have that bottom-up, which may come back to education. If you're not literate or if you don't understand your rights, how can you go anywhere and actually demand what you know is being committed to by your government? It's probably a topic in detail for another discussion, but there are clear international guidelines on civil-military relations. It's extremely important from our point of view that those are followed, otherwise that can create serious problems on the ground, and on the whole the UK Armed Forces have been pretty good at that, and as a consequence have had good relations with NGOs on the ground. Well, last but not least, let me just kind of illustrate some of those principles with a few examples from recent or current conflicts. I think if you look at the Haiti earthquake last year, we certainly saw as NGOs what military can do when they come in as a last resort, when it's really only they who can do something. There was some immensely effective work with heavy earth-moving equipment, and that gave rapid access and helped to deliver supplies and save lives in ways that wouldn't be possible otherwise. But I think Haiti provides counter-examples as well. We saw a fairly high-profile intervention by the Spanish army to provide water and vaccination, and we estimated that to cost about 18 times what the comparable civilian effort would have costed, and to some extent it duplicated efforts that were also underway, though it's not only the military who were responsible for some duplication in Haiti last year, of course. I think what we've seen in Afghanistan over the years of the conflict since 2001 is really too many, numerous examples of poorly conceived hearts and minds projects. We've seen things that have been ineffective and costly. We've seen military go in and build schools that when they don't understand good development principles, when they're not consulting with communities, when they don't understand what girls need before they will be allowed to go to school, when they don't understand how it may put local communities at risk of being targeted by insurgent forces if they are seen to build the schools and so on. And actually, the UK has pulled back in the last few years from those sorts of projects, but not everyone else has, unfortunately. And I think when you pull back and do it in a different way, what we've seen again is that it's possible. There's been thousands of schools built or set up in existing local community centres led by local communities that have managed in a much more low-profile way with community buy-in to get thousands and tens of thousands of people to school. I don't want to give any particularly more detailed examples, but I think in the case of Somalia, where Oxfam operates mostly through local partners, we have seen in some cases the humanitarian agenda getting over-intertwined with the political agenda that can of donors, often of Western countries. And again, that's not particularly a comment targeted at the UK. That can cause real problems, both of actual putting local lives at risk, but also of access. There is a real issue for us in many ways as an international NGO as to access to different types of conflicts and different types of countries. So that's just one more of the numerous reasons for the neutrality and humanitarian principles to to be respected. I've also mentioned the case of Yemen. I think, again, that's somewhere where the UK has also, once again, actually tended to lead in terms of focusing on pro-poor development rather than focusing on confusing that with a counter-terrorism strategy. But again, it's not the same for all other donors. So I think that's just a rather brief overview of some of our approaches to this. I hope that's given you an idea both of how we operate as an international NGO, the sorts of things that concern us, and why we do periodically, as in this paper I mentioned from last month, warn about politicisation of aid, raise questions if we think anybody who's at the forefront of good behaviour, like the UK government, might be at the risk of going in the wrong direction. I think I was in Brussels last week. I think what we see in Europe with the establishment of the External Action Service, the European Diplomatic Corps, is a whole tendency to actually putting development and European foreign policy together. They call it a whole-of-country approach. That, for us, rings a lot of alarm bells, and I think it goes back to what I said halfway through my speech. Is coherence for who? Is it coherence for the country on the ground, or is it coherence in the interest of the people providing the money? Because if it's the latter, that's a problem for the country, and it's also a problem for independent actors like us trying to be there and trying to provide aid. Thank you.